when 11-year-old Prince George asked his father why people were sleeping outside in the cold. Prince William realized it was time for a conversation that would change everything. What began as a simple question from a curious child would soon transform into a royal mission that captured the world's attention and brought unprecedented focus to one of Britain's most pressing social issues. This isn't just another story about royal duties or ceremonial visits. This is about a father teaching his son that true leadership means seeing beyond palace walls, about a future king learning that real nobility comes from serving those who have lost everything. As winter gripped London and homelessness reached crisis levels, the Prince of Wales made a decision that would challenge royal protocol, inspire a nation, and prove that sometimes the most powerful voices for change come from the most unexpected places. The story you're about to read reveals how a single outing between father and son became a turning point in Britain's fight against homelessness, and why this moment might be remembered as the day the monarchy truly began to change. The morning started like any other at Adelaide Cottage. Prince William was reviewing his schedule over breakfast when Prince George appeared at his elbow, still in his pajamas, hair tousled from sleep. The 11-year-old had that particular look in his eyes that his father had come to recognize as the precursor to one of his thoughtful questions. "Papa," George began, settling into the chair beside William. "Yesterday, when we drove through London, I saw people sleeping on the streets. Why don't they have homes?" William paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. He had been expecting this question for some time, knowing that his children's awareness of the world beyond their privileged circumstances was inevitable. But hearing it spoken so directly, with such genuine concern, still caught him off guard. The drive George was referring to had taken them through central London after a family dinner at a restaurant near Covent Garden. Traffic had been heavy, giving them plenty of time to observe the city around them. William had noticed his son's silence during that journey, the way George had pressed his face to the window, watching the people they passed with unusual intensity. "That's a very important question, George," William replied, setting down his cup and giving his son his full attention. "There are many reasons why people might not have homes. Sometimes they lose their jobs and can't pay rent. Sometimes they become ill and can't work. Sometimes they don't have family to help them." George nodded solemnly, processing this information with the serious consideration he applied to all matters that puzzled him. But couldn't someone help them? Couldn't the government give them houses? The innocence of the question highlighted the complexity of the issue in a way that made William's heart ache. How do you explain to a child that in one of the world's wealthiest nations, thousands of people sleep rough every night while others debate policy and funding allocation? "People are trying to help," William explained carefully. "There are charities and organizations working very hard to support people who don't have homes. But it's a complicated problem, and there aren't easy solutions." This conversation was taking place just as winter was settling over Britain with unusual harshness. The previous night's news had reported that temperatures would drop to the lowest levels in decades. William couldn't shake the image of people huddled in doorways and under bridges, trying to survive conditions that would challenge even those with proper shelter. Catherine entered the kitchen just as George was asking his next question. "Could we help them? Could we do something?" She caught William's eye over their son's head, recognizing immediately that something significant was happening. Catherine had always admired William's ability to engage with their children's questions thoughtfully, never dismissing their concerns or oversimplifying complex issues. "We do help," William said. "The foundation does a lot of work supporting people who are homeless. But you're asking if we could do more, aren't you?" George nodded emphatically. "Yes. If I'm going to be king someday, shouldn't I understand what it's like for people who don't have what we have?" The statement hung in the air between them. Here was their 11-year-old son grappling not just with social inequality, but with his future responsibility as monarch. William felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Pride that George was developing such compassion and awareness, concern about how to channel these feelings into something meaningful without overwhelming him. Catherine sat down across from them, having caught enough of the conversation to understand its direction. "What are you thinking?" she asked George gently. "I want to see for myself," George said with the determined tone that reminded William so much of his own mother. "I want to talk to people who don't have homes. I want to understand what happened to them and what they need." William exchanged another look with Catherine. This wasn't a whim or a passing curiosity. George had clearly been thinking about this seriously, probably since their drive through London. The intensity in his young son's eyes reminded William of conversations he'd had with his own mother about her charity work, about the importance of understanding the experiences of people whose lives were nothing like their own. "That's a very mature thing to want to do," William said slowly. "But it would need to be done carefully, respectfully. These are real people with real problems, not a tourist attraction." "I know that," George replied, slightly indignant. "I'm not little anymore, Papa. I understand that people are suffering." The truth of that statement settled over William with unexpected weight. When had his son grown old enough to grasp such concepts? When had he developed the emotional maturity to want to engage with difficult realities rather than simply accepting the comfortable distance that royal life naturally provided? Later that morning, after George had gone upstairs to get dressed for school, William found himself walking in the cottage's small garden, thinking about his son's request. The autumn air was crisp, and he could see his breath as he considered the implications of what George was asking for. It wasn't unprecedented for young royals to engage with social issues, but it was usually done through carefully orchestrated visits to established charities with extensive preparation and security protocols. What George was proposing was different, more direct, more personal. William thought about his own childhood, about the moments when his mother had tried to show him and Harry that their privilege came with responsibility. He remembered visiting homeless shelters with Diana, how those experiences had shaped his understanding of the world and his role in it. But times had changed since then. Security concerns were more complex, media attention more intense, social media creating new challenges for any public appearance by members of the royal family. Taking George into the streets of London to meet homeless people would require careful planning and consideration of numerous factors. Yet something in his son's question continued to resonate with William throughout the day. During meetings about upcoming royal engagements, during conversations about policy briefings, during the routine business of his role as Prince of Wales, George's words echoed in his mind. "If I'm going to be king someday, shouldn't I understand what it's like for people who don't have what we have?" By evening, William had made his decision. He would find a way to honor George's request, but he would do it properly. This wouldn't be a spontaneous street walk or an unplanned encounter. It would be a thoughtful, respectful engagement that could serve multiple purposes, educating George about homelessness, demonstrating royal commitment to addressing the issue, and potentially bringing new attention and resources to organizations working to solve it. That night, as he was putting George to bed, William brought up the morning's conversation again. "I've been thinking about what you said today," he told his son, "about wanting to understand homelessness better." George sat up straighter in his bed, immediately alert. "And I think it's important that you learn about these things, especially given your future role. But if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. We need to work with people who understand homelessness, who can help us learn and maybe contribute something meaningful." "You mean we're actually going to do it?" George's excitement was barely contained. "We're going to explore the possibility," William said carefully. "I'll need to talk to some people, make some arrangements. This isn't something we can just decide to do tomorrow." But even as he spoke, William was already thinking about who he needed to call, which organizations might be willing to facilitate such a visit, how to balance education with respect, publicity with privacy. As he left George's room that night, William realized that his son had asked exactly the right question at exactly the right time. Britain's homelessness crisis was worsening, winter was approaching, and public awareness of the issue seemed to be declining despite the growing numbers of people sleeping rough. Perhaps what was needed was exactly what George was proposing, a direct human connection that could cut through policy debates and political rhetoric to focus attention on the real people affected by homelessness. The next few days would prove that sometimes the most powerful catalysts for change come from the simplest, most honest questions, asked by someone young enough to believe that if something is wrong, it should be fixed, and that if you have the power to help, you have the obligation to try. The phone call that would change everything came on a Thursday morning. William had spent 3 days reaching out to contacts in the homelessness sector, trying to find the right organization and the right approach for what George had requested. He needed somewhere that could handle the complexities of a royal visit while maintaining the authenticity and respect that the situation demanded. Sarah Chun, director of Pathways Trust, a London-based homelessness charity, had been recommended by multiple sources as someone who understood both the practical realities of street homelessness and the delicate nature of high-profile visits. When William's private secretary called to arrange a conversation, Sarah's first reaction was skepticism. Another royal walkthrough, she had thought, imagining the usual scenario of carefully stage-managed encounters with pre-selected clients who had been coached on what to say. But when William himself called her later that day, something in his voice suggested this might be different. "Ms. Chun," William began, "I'll be direct with you. My son George has been asking difficult questions about homelessness, and he's expressed a genuine desire to understand what people without homes are going through. I'm not looking to arrange a photo opportunity or a ceremonial visit. I wanted to have real conversations with real people, if that's something you think could be beneficial for everyone involved." Sarah paused, surprised by the straightforward approach. In her 15 years working with homeless populations, she had hosted numerous visits from politicians, celebrities, and minor royals. Most had been well-intentioned, but ultimately superficial exercises that did more for the visitors' public image than for the people they claimed to want to help. "What does real conversations mean to you?" she asked carefully. "It means George asking questions and listening to the answers, even if they're uncomfortable. It means people being able to tell their stories without worrying about saying the wrong thing for a camera. It means treating this as education for my son, not as a publicity event." There was something in William's tone that made Sarah reconsider her initial skepticism. She had heard about his work with mental health charities, about his willingness to engage with difficult topics in ways that went beyond traditional royal involvement. "Can I ask why this is important to you?" she said. William was quiet for a moment. "Because George is going to be king someday, and I want him to understand that the crown isn't just about ceremony and tradition. It's about service to people who might never live in palaces or attend state banquets. And, frankly, because I think exposure to these realities might be good for both of us." Over the course of their conversation, Sarah found herself increasingly impressed by William's approach. He asked informed questions about homelessness trends, about the effectiveness of current support systems, about the daily realities faced by people sleeping rough. This wasn't someone looking for a quick, feel-good experience. This was someone genuinely trying to understand a complex social issue. "If we were to arrange something," Sarah said carefully, "it would need to be completely voluntary for our clients. No one should feel pressured to participate because royalty is involved." "Absolutely," William agreed immediately. "And I wanted guidance on how to make this as comfortable and beneficial as possible for everyone." They spent another 20 minutes discussing logistics and possibilities. Sarah explained the work that Pathways Trust did, operating both a day center where homeless people could access showers, meals, and support services, and an outreach program that connected with people living on the streets. "I think the day center might be a better starting point," Sarah suggested. "People there are usually feeling a bit more stable, they're in a safe environment, and they can choose whether or not to engage. Some of our regular visitors are incredibly articulate about their experiences and quite willing to share their stories if they feel respected." William found himself feeling cautiously optimistic about the conversation. Sarah Chun clearly understood the balance between public engagement and personal dignity that he was hoping to achieve. "There's one more thing," William said as their conversation was winding down. "I don't want this to be a secret visit, but I also don't want it to become a media circus. If we do this, I'd like to be transparent about why we're there and what we're hoping to learn, but I don't want photographers following us around or people feeling like they're performing for cameras." "That's refreshing," Sarah replied. "Most high-profile visits come with entire media teams. How are you thinking of handling publicity?" "Maybe a simple statement before the visit explaining our intention, and then perhaps some follow-up discussion about what we learned and how people can get involved in supporting homelessness services. But during the actual visit, no cameras, no interviews, just conversation." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her office thinking about what William had proposed. In recent months, she had noticed increased interest from politicians and media figures wanting to demonstrate their concern about homelessness, usually timed to coincide with fundraising campaigns or election seasons. Most of these visits felt exploitative, using vulnerable people as props for other people's agendas. This felt different, though she wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was William's willingness to discuss the educational aspect for his son openly, his acknowledgement that this was as much about his family learning as about raising awareness. Perhaps it was his stated preference for privacy over publicity. That evening, Sarah brought up the possibility with her team during their regular weekly meeting. The reaction was mixed. Some staff members were excited about the potential for increased funding and awareness that royal attention might bring. Others were skeptical about disrupting their clients' routines for what might ultimately be an empty gesture. Marcus Thompson, an outreach worker who had been with Pathways Trust for 8 years, voiced the concern that several others were thinking. What happens after they leave? Do we get one morning of royal attention and then everything goes back to normal while they feel good about themselves? It was a fair question, one that Sarah had been considering herself. She had seen too many well-meaning visits that generated brief spikes in donations and volunteers, only to fade from public attention within weeks. "That's exactly why I'm bringing this to the team," Sarah replied. "If we do this, how do we make sure it creates lasting benefit? How do we use this opportunity strategically?" The discussion that followed was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Her team knew better than anyone what homeless people in their area actually needed: more affordable housing, better mental health services, job training programs, addiction support. They also knew that public understanding of homelessness was often limited to stereotypes and misconceptions. "Maybe the value isn't just in the visit itself," suggested Emma Rodriguez, who coordinated the day center's activities. "Maybe it's in the conversation that happens afterwards. If a future king is learning about homelessness, that sends a message about what society should care about." By the end of the meeting, the team had reached a consensus. They would move forward with planning the visit, but with clear conditions. Participation would be entirely voluntary for their clients. The focus would be on genuine conversation rather than performance, and they would use any resulting publicity to push for specific policy changes and funding increases. Sarah called William back the next morning with their decision and their conditions. His immediate agreement to everything they proposed convinced her that they had made the right choice. Over the following week, the planning process revealed just how different this visit was going to be. Instead of requesting security briefings and crowd control measures, William's team asked for information about homelessness statistics and background on effective support programs. Instead of demanding special arrangements or accommodations, they asked what would be most comfortable for the people they would be meeting. George, meanwhile, had been preparing for the visit with characteristic thoroughness. William had given him several books about homelessness and social inequality appropriate for his reading level. They had watched documentaries together and discussed the various factors that could lead to someone losing their home. "I've been reading about addiction," George told his father one evening as they walked through Kensington Palace Gardens. "It says that sometimes people become homeless because they have problems with drugs or alcohol, but sometimes they start using drugs or alcohol because they're homeless and it's hard to cope." William was struck again by his son's ability to grasp complex, interconnected issues. "That's exactly right. It's often not a simple cause and effect. People's problems can feed into each other in complicated ways. So when we meet people," George continued, "I shouldn't assume I know why they don't have homes." "That's very wise," William replied. The best thing you can do is listen to what they choose to tell you and ask respectful questions if they seem open to it. As the date for their visit approached, word began to spread through the homelessness community that something unusual was being planned. Sarah had briefed some of their regular day center visitors about the possibility of meeting Prince William and Prince George, emphasizing that participation was completely optional and that the focus would be on sharing experiences and information rather than asking for anything specific. The response was more positive than she had expected. Several long-term clients expressed interest in participating, saying they appreciated the opportunity to help a young person understand what homelessness was really like. Most people see us and either look away or see us as problems to be solved, said David Morrison, who had been homeless for 3 years after losing his job and apartment following a workplace injury. If someone from the royal family wants to actually listen to what we have to say, maybe other people will start listening too. The night before the scheduled visit, William found himself both nervous and excited. This was uncharted territory for him as both a royal and a parent. He was taking his 11-year-old son into an environment where they would encounter real suffering and real hardship, trusting that George was mature enough to handle what they might hear and see. But as he watched George carefully reading through information about housing policy that would challenge many adults, William felt confident that they were doing the right thing. His son was asking important questions and deserving honest answers, even if those answers were complicated and sometimes uncomfortable. Tomorrow would test whether good intentions could translate into meaningful engagement, whether royal attention could generate lasting change, and whether an 11-year-old's compassion could help bridge the gap between privilege and poverty in modern Britain. The morning of the visit dawned gray and cold, with a sharp wind that made everyone on the street hurry toward whatever warmth they could find. At the Pathways Trust Day Center in South London, the usual morning routine was underway, but with an undercurrent of anticipation that Sarah Chun could feel as soon as she walked through the door. The center occupied a converted Victorian warehouse, its high ceilings and large windows creating an airy space that felt welcoming rather than institutional. Mismatched furniture donated by various sources created comfortable seating areas, and the walls displayed artwork created by some of the center's visitors, alongside information about available services and upcoming events. Sarah had arrived early to check that everything was prepared, not in terms of special arrangements for their royal visitors, but to ensure that the space felt normal and comfortable for everyone who would be there. About 20 people had chosen to be present during the visit, some longtime center regulars who had expressed interest in meeting William and George, others who simply wanted to go about their usual morning routine regardless of who else might be there. David Morrison was sitting at his usual table near the back, nursing a cup of tea and reading a newspaper someone had left behind. At 62, David had become something of an elder statesman among the center's visitors, someone who newcomers often turned to for advice about navigating Bow Street life and the various support services available. His journey to homelessness had begun 3 years earlier when a construction accident injured his back, making it impossible for him to continue his work as a carpenter. Without income, he had quickly fallen behind on rent and, without family support or savings, had found himself sleeping rough within months. "You nervous about this morning?" asked Jenny Walsh, settling into the chair across from him. Jenny was 45, with prematurely gray hair and eyes that reflected both hardness and humor. She had been homeless on and off for 5 years, struggling with mental health issues that made it difficult to maintain steady employment or housing. "Not nervous exactly," David replied. "Curious, I suppose. Most people who visit here are either trying to help us or trying to understand us for some purpose of their own. Wonder what category these two fall into." Jenny laughed, but not unkindly. Maybe the boy will be different. Kids usually see things more clearly than adults. Across the room, Emma Rodriguez was setting up the usual morning activities. A computer station where people could search for jobs or housing, an area where someone could get help with paperwork or benefit applications, and a quiet corner with books and magazines. She had deliberately avoided making any special preparations, wanting the center to feel like itself rather than like a stage set. At 10:30, Sarah received a text message that William and George had arrived and were speaking briefly with security personnel outside. She had arranged for them to enter through the main door like any other visitors, rather than through some special entrance that would emphasize the difference between them and everyone else present. When the door opened and William and George walked in, the reaction was subtler than Sarah had expected. Conversations didn't stop. People didn't stare or rush over for introductions. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, heads turning briefly to take note of the newcomers before returning to whatever activities had been occupying them. William was dressed casually in dark jeans and a wool sweater, while George wore similar clothes that made him look like any 11-year-old spending a morning out with his father. The absence of formal royal attire seemed to put people at ease, sending a signal that this wasn't a ceremonial occasion. Sarah approached them with a warm smile. "Welcome to Pathways Trust. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having us," William replied. "We're really looking forward to learning more about the work you do here." George hung slightly behind his father, but his eyes were already taking in everything around him with the intense curiosity that had started this entire process. He was clearly trying to understand this new environment, to piece together how this space functioned and what role it played in people's lives. "Would you like me to introduce you to some people?" Sarah asked. "Or would you prefer to just walk around and see how the center operates?" "I think we'd like to meet people," William said, glancing at George, who nodded emphatically. "But only if they're interested in meeting us." Sarah led them first to David Morrison, who had indicated the previous day that he would be willing to talk with them. As they approached his table, David stood up with a slight smile. "David, I'd like you to meet Prince William and Prince George," Sarah said simply. "Pleased to meet you both," David said, extending his hand first to William, then to George. "I'm David Morrison. Sarah tells me you're here to learn about what it's like being homeless." "Yes, sir," George replied, surprising himself with how naturally the respectful address came out. "I've been reading about homelessness, but I wanted to understand what it's really like from someone who's experienced it." David gestured for them to sit down at his table. "Well, I can certainly tell you about that. Though I should warn you, it's not a simple story." For the next 20 minutes, David shared his journey with remarkable honesty. He talked about his accident, about the medical bills that consumed his savings, about the bureaucratic challenges of applying for disability benefits while living on the street. He described the daily realities of homelessness, where to find safe places to sleep, how to stay clean, the constant uncertainty about where your next meal might come from. George listened with complete attention, asking questions that revealed both his youth and his sincere desire to understand. "When you were first sleeping outside, were you scared?" "Terrified," David admitted. "I'd never imagined I'd end up in that situation. I kept thinking it was temporary, that I'd figure something out quickly. It took me a while to accept that I needed help, that I couldn't solve this problem on my own." "What kind of help?" George asked. "Places like this," David gestured around the center. "Not just for practical things like showers and meals, though those are important, but for the feeling that you're still a person, that you still matter. When you're homeless, a lot of people stop seeing you as human. They see you as a problem or a statistic." William found himself deeply moved by David's straightforward way of speaking, by his willingness to share difficult truths without self-pity or blame. "What would you want people to understand about homelessness?" he asked. David considered the question carefully. "I'd want them to understand that it can happen to anyone. I worked for 40 years, owned my own tools, took pride in my craftsmanship. I wasn't someone who made bad decisions or didn't try hard enough. Sometimes life just hits you with more than you can handle alone." From David's table, they moved on to meet Jenny Walsh, who was working on a job application at one of the computer stations. Jenny's story was different, but equally compelling. She talked about struggling with depression and anxiety, about how mental health issues had made it difficult to maintain employment, about the cycle of stress and instability that homelessness created. "The worst part isn't sleeping rough," Jenny told them. It's the way people look at you, or don't look at you. It's feeling invisible, feeling like you don't count anymore. George absorbed this with visible concern. But you do count. Everyone counts. Jenny smiled, the first genuine smile William had seen from her. Thank you for saying that. It's easy to forget sometimes. As they continued through the center, meeting other visitors and learning about the various services provided, William began to understand something important. This wasn't just about individual stories of hardship, though those stories were powerful and moving. This was about a systemic failure to provide adequate support for people facing various forms of crisis, and about the resilience and dignity that people maintained even in incredibly difficult circumstances. Emma Rodriguez joined them as they toured the center's facilities, explaining how the computer lab helped people search for employment and housing, how the shower facilities allowed people to maintain personal hygiene essential for job interviews, how the mailing address service gave people without homes a way to receive important documents. It's about meeting people where they are, Emma explained. Not everyone who comes here wants to talk about their problems or participate in formal programs. Sometimes people just need a warm, safe place to sit for a few hours. George was particularly interested in the artwork displayed on the walls. One piece caught his attention, a detailed pencil drawing of a city street scene, showing both the busy pedestrians hurrying past and the homeless individuals they were ignoring. One of our visitors drew that, Emma explained. Marcus Williams. He's been an artist his whole life, but it's hard to pursue creative work when you're worried about basic survival. Could I meet him? George asked. Marcus was sitting in the quiet reading area, sketching in a notebook. When Emma introduced him to William and George, he seemed surprised, but pleased by their interest in his artwork. I draw what I see, Marcus explained, showing them some of his recent sketches. Street life, people helping each other, the contrast between different worlds that exist in the same city. George studied the drawings with fascination. These are really good. Do you sell them? Sometimes, Marcus replied. There's not much market for homeless artists, but Emma helps me display them sometimes, and occasionally someone buys one. The conversation with Marcus revealed another dimension of homelessness that George hadn't considered. How creative talents and professional skills didn't disappear just because someone lost their housing. Marcus had studied art in college, had worked as a graphic designer before mental health issues and addiction derailed his career. He was talented, intelligent, and articulate, challenging any stereotypes about who becomes homeless and why. As their visit continued, William noticed how naturally George was engaging with everyone they met. His son wasn't treating these encounters as charity work or as fulfilling some royal obligation. He was genuinely curious about people's experiences, genuinely concerned about their well-being, genuinely interested in understanding how society could better support people in crisis. The morning was revealing not just the realities of homelessness, but the character of his son. George's questions were thoughtful, his responses compassionate, but not patronizing. He was treating everyone they met as individuals with valuable perspectives, not as objects of pity or examples of social problems. By the time they had been at the center for 2 hours, word had spread among other visitors that the royal guests were there not for a photo opportunity, but for genuine conversation. People who had initially kept their distance began approaching, wanting to share their own stories or simply to meet the young prince who was listening so intently to everyone he encountered. The impact was flowing in both directions. William could see that George was being profoundly affected by what he was hearing and seeing, but it was also clear that the center's visitors were moved by the genuine interest and respect they were receiving from their royal guests. As their visit began to wind down, Sarah gathered William and George at her office for a brief conversation about what they had experienced and what they might do with what they had learned. "What surprised you most about today?" she asked George. George thought for a moment. How normal everyone is. I mean, I know that sounds strange, but I expected homeless people to be different somehow. But everyone we met just seemed like regular people who had bad things happen to them. That's exactly right, Sarah replied. Homelessness isn't about personal failings or character flaws. It's about what happens when people face crises without adequate support systems. As they prepared to leave, several people they had met approached to say goodbye. David Morrison shook hands with both William and George, thanking them for their time and attention. "You ask good questions, young man," he told George. "Keep asking them." The visit was ending, but William could already sense that its impact would be lasting, both for his son and for everyone who had participated in these remarkable morning conversations. The drive back to Kensington Palace was unusually quiet. George sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the London streets with new eyes, processing everything he had seen and heard during their morning at Pathways Trust. William glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, recognizing the thoughtful expression that meant George was working through something important. "What are you thinking about?" William asked as they stopped at a traffic light. "David," George replied immediately. "He said homelessness could happen to anyone. He worked for 40 years and still ended up on the street because of one accident. That's not fair." "No, it's not fair," William agreed. "Life isn't always fair, and sometimes our systems for helping people aren't as strong as they should be." George was quiet for another few minutes before speaking again. "Jenny said people made her feel invisible. But she's not invisible. None of them are invisible." The profound simplicity of his son's observations struck William once again. In 3 hours, George had grasped something that many adults struggled to understand: that homeless people remain fully human, deserving of dignity and attention regardless of their circumstances. That evening, the family gathered for dinner at Adelaide Cottage. Catherine had been eager to hear about their morning, and Louis and Charlotte listened with interest as George recounted some of what he had learned. He told them about David's artwork, about Jenny's job search, about Marcus's drawings, treating each person as an individual rather than as an example of a social problem. "It sounds like you learned a lot today," Catherine observed. "I did," George replied seriously. "But I also realized how much I still don't understand. Why don't we have enough houses for everyone? Why is it so hard for people to get help when they need it?" These weren't questions with simple answers, and William found himself explaining complex issues of housing policy, social services, and economic inequality to an 11-year-old who was determined to understand the world he would someday help govern. Meanwhile, at Pathways Trust, the impact of the morning's visit was still being felt. Sarah Chun had called a brief staff meeting to debrief about how things had gone and to discuss how they might build on whatever momentum the royal visit had created. "I have to admit, I'm impressed," said Marcus Thompson, the outreach worker who had initially been skeptical about the visit. "They actually listened. The kid asked real questions, and the father didn't try to turn it into a photo opportunity." Emma Rodriguez agreed. "Several people have mentioned to me this afternoon how much they appreciated being treated with respect." David Morrison said it was the first time in years that someone with that kind of influence actually seemed to care about his story. The team spent the next hour discussing how to leverage the positive attention that would inevitably result from news of the visit. They had already received 3 calls from journalists wanting to know details about what had happened, and Sarah expected many more in the coming days. "We need to be strategic about this," Sarah said. "If we handle this right, we can use the media attention to educate people about homelessness and push for policy changes. If we handle it wrong, it becomes a one-day story that doesn't help anyone." They decided to prepare a comprehensive media response that would focus on the broader issues rather than on the royal visit itself. They would use interviews to highlight the need for more affordable housing, better mental health services, and more effective support systems for people facing crises. Word of the visit was already beginning to spread through social media and news outlets. William's private secretary had issued a brief statement explaining that the Prince of Wales and Prince George had visited Pathways Trust as part of George's education about social issues, emphasizing that the focus had been on learning rather than publicity. The statement was carefully worded to respect the privacy of everyone they had met while acknowledging the educational nature of the visit. It mentioned that both William and George had been moved by the stories they heard, and the resilience they witnessed, and that they looked forward to continued engagement with organizations working to address homelessness. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by major news outlets across Britain and internationally. Most coverage was positive, focusing on the unusual nature of a royal visit that prioritized learning and listening over ceremony and publicity. The Guardian ran a thoughtful piece about youth homelessness, using the royal visit as a starting point for discussing broader policy issues. The BBC interviewed Sarah Chan about the work of Pathways Trust and the daily realities faced by homeless people in London. Several tabloids focused on George's maturity and compassion, though William was pleased to note that most coverage respected the privacy of the people they had met. What surprised William most was the public response. Within hours of the story breaking, Pathways Trust had received dozens of calls from people wanting to volunteer or make donations. Other homelessness charities across the country reported similar increases in interest and support. "It's like people were waiting for permission to care about this issue," Sarah told William during a phone call 3 days after the visit. "Your son's questions are the same questions many people have, but they didn't know it was okay to ask them." The impact extended beyond immediate charitable giving. Several members of Parliament reached out to William's office asking about briefings on homelessness policy. Local councils reported increased interest in housing initiatives. Universities contacted Pathways Trust asking about research partnerships. Most significantly, Downing Street indicated interest in a cross-party initiative to address homelessness more comprehensively, with William being invited to chair a working group that would develop new policy recommendations. George, meanwhile, was wrestling with questions about what he should do with what he had learned. The visit to Pathways Trust had been educational, but it had also been transformative. He couldn't simply return to his normal routine, pretending that homelessness was someone else's problem. "I want to do more," he told his father one evening as they walked through Hyde Park. Meeting those people was important, but it's not enough just to meet them. They need help. "What kind of help are you thinking about?" William asked. "Real help," George replied with a determination that was becoming familiar. "Not just charity visits or giving money, though those things are important too. I mean help that actually solves the problem." William was struck again by his son's mature approach to complex issues. At 11, George was already understanding that meaningful change required more than good intentions. It required sustained effort and systemic solutions. Over the following weeks, William and George developed a plan for deeper engagement with homelessness issues. They would continue visiting organizations like Pathways Trust, but they would also learn about housing policy, social services, and the various factors that contributed to homelessness in Britain. George began reading about housing economics and social policy with the same intensity he had previously applied to history and science. He started following news stories about homelessness with personal investment, understanding that the statistics and policy debates affected real people he had met and cared about. The transformation in George was noticed by everyone around him. His tutors reported that he was connecting his academic studies to social issues with new sophistication. His siblings found him more thoughtful and serious, but also more passionate about making a positive difference in the world. Catherine observed the change in her eldest son with pride and some concern. Pride because George was developing the empathy and social awareness that would serve him well as a future king. Concern because she worried about the weight of responsibility he was placing on his young shoulders. "He's growing up very quickly," she mentioned to William one night after George had spent an hour reading reports about housing policy rather than playing video games. "Yes, he is," William replied. "But I think that's what happens when you start seeing the world as it really is rather than as you wish it were." The royal visit to Pathways Trust had been intended as an educational experience for George, a way to satisfy his curiosity about homelessness and help him understand the realities faced by people less fortunate than himself. But it had become something much more significant, a catalyst for broader public engagement with homelessness, a demonstration of how royal influence could be used to focus attention on important social issues, and a transformative experience for a young prince who was beginning to understand the true meaning of public service. 3 months after the visit, Pathways Trust had doubled its volunteer base and increased its funding by 60%. More importantly, the organization had become a model for how homeless services could engage with both individual clients and broader policy discussions. David Morrison had found temporary housing through a program that connected him with other tradespeople who could offer employment opportunities. Jenny Walsh had started volunteering at the center while continuing to receive support for her mental health issues. Marcus Williams had sold several of his drawings and was working on a series that would be displayed in a gallery exhibition about homelessness and urban life. The success stories were encouraging, but William and George both understood that individual successes didn't solve systemic problems. The real test of their visit's impact would be whether it contributed to lasting changes in how Britain addressed homelessness as a social issue. As winter deepened and temperatures dropped to dangerous levels, the urgency of the homelessness crisis became even more apparent. But for the first time in years, there seemed to be genuine momentum for comprehensive action, sparked in part by an 11-year-old's simple question about why people were sleeping on the streets. The ripples from that morning at Pathways Trust were spreading wider than anyone had anticipated, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would continue to unfold for years to come. 6 months after their first visit to Pathways Trust, Prince George stood before a parliamentary committee, the youngest person ever to address MPs about social policy. The invitation had come after word spread about his continued engagement with homelessness issues and his remarkably mature understanding of the complexities involved. The committee room was intimidating, with its formal wood paneling and rows of serious-faced politicians. But George had prepared thoroughly for this moment. Beside him sat William, though not as the Prince of Wales, but as a proud father watching his son take his first steps into meaningful public service. "Honorable members," George began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. 6 months ago, I asked my father a simple question about why people sleep on the streets. Today, I want to share what I've learned since then and why I believe we can do better as a country. The room was completely silent. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. A future king, still a child, speaking from genuine experience and conviction about one of society's most pressing challenges. George spoke for 15 minutes, describing not just his visits to homeless shelters and day centers, but the research he had conducted into housing policy, the experts he had interviewed, and the data he had studied. He talked about David Morrison's struggle with disability benefits, about Jenny Walsh's battle with mental health stigma, about Marcus Williams' difficulty pursuing his art while worried about basic survival. These aren't just statistics or policy problems, George said, looking directly at the MPs. These are people I've met, people I've learned from, people who deserve better from all of us. The questions that followed revealed how seriously the committee members were taking George's presentation. They asked about specific policy proposals, about the effectiveness of current programs, about his recommendations for improving coordination between different support services. George answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on months of study and dozens of conversations with both homeless individuals and service providers. When he didn't know something, he said so honestly, often suggesting experts who could provide better information. "What has surprised you most about homelessness?" asked Margaret Patterson, the committee chairwoman. George considered the question carefully. How quickly it can happen to anyone, and how hard it is to escape once you're in that situation. Also, how much talent and potential is being wasted because we're not providing adequate support systems. After George's testimony, several committee members approached him personally to thank him for his insights and to ask about future collaboration. The session had been filmed and would be broadcast that evening, ensuring that George's message would reach far beyond the committee room. The media response was extraordinary. International news outlets covered the story of the young prince who was using his platform to advocate for homeless people. Editorial writers praised his maturity and commitment, while social media exploded with support for his message and his approach. More importantly, the practical impact was immediate and substantial. Within hours of the broadcast, homelessness charities across Britain reported surge in volunteers and donations. The government announced acceleration of several housing initiatives that had been stalled in committee. Local councils contacted Pathways Trust and similar organizations asking how to implement more effective support programs. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the change in public discourse about homelessness. George's testimony had reframed the issue from one of charity and pity to one of justice and social responsibility. People began talking about homelessness as a solvable problem rather than an inevitable tragedy. Back at Pathways Trust, Sarah Chun was coordinating responses to hundreds of inquiries from organizations wanting to replicate their model of respectful, dignified service provision. The center had become a national example of best practices, hosting study visits from social workers, policymakers, and service providers from across Europe. None of this would have happened without that first visit, Sarah told her team during a monthly meeting. Not because of the royal connection, but because of the genuine engagement and the questions that followed. David Morrison had become something of a spokesperson for the experience of older homeless people, speaking at conferences and helping to design programs specifically for people who became homeless later in life due to illness or injury. His articulate advocacy had helped change perceptions about who becomes homeless and why. Jenny Walsh had completed a training program in peer counseling and was now working part-time at Pathways Trust, using her own experience with mental health challenges to support others facing similar struggles. Her journey from client to staff member illustrated the potential that could be unlocked when people received appropriate support. Marcus Williams had not only found stable housing, but had also been commissioned to create a series of murals for London Underground stations, depicting themes of urban life and community resilience. His art was reaching thousands of people daily, quietly challenging stereotypes and encouraging empathy. These individual success stories were encouraging, but William and George both understood that lasting change required more than helping specific people. It required transforming systems and changing attitudes across society. The working group on homelessness that William had been asked to chair was making substantial progress. With George often attending meetings as an observer, the group had developed comprehensive recommendations addressing housing affordability, mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and job training programs. What made the group's work different was its inclusion of people with lived experience of homelessness. Following George's example of listening to and learning from homeless people themselves, the working group made sure that policy recommendations were informed by the practical realities of street life and the daily challenges of accessing support services. George's role in these meetings was primarily to ask questions and to ensure that discussions remained grounded in human impact rather than getting lost in bureaucratic details. His youth gave him a unique perspective, allowing him to cut through political considerations and focus on what would actually help people. Sometimes I think we make this more complicated than it needs to be, George said during one meeting where the discussion had become bogged down in funding mechanisms. We know what people need: safe places to live, help with mental health problems, job opportunities, and dignity. Why can't we just focus on providing those things? His straightforward approach often helped redirect conversations toward practical solutions rather than theoretical debates. Committee members found themselves explaining policies in terms of human impact rather than administrative convenience, a change that led to more effective and compassionate recommendations. As George's 12th birthday approached, his engagement with homelessness issues had become a defining aspect of his public role. He was no longer just a curious child asking questions. He had become an informed advocate with genuine expertise and credibility. The transformation was evident in the way organizations sought his input, the way politicians listened to his observations, and the way media treated his statements as newsworthy in their own right rather than just as cute stories about a royal child. But the most important change was in George himself. The shy, thoughtful boy who had asked why people sleep on the streets had developed into a confident young person with clear convictions about social justice and a practical understanding of how to create change. I used to think being king meant wearing crowns and living in palaces, George told his parents one evening as they discussed his upcoming confirmation. Now, I understand it's about serving people who might never live in palaces and using whatever influence you have to make life better for everyone. William felt a profound sense of pride and accomplishment hearing his son articulate this understanding. The visit to Pathways Trust had been intended to answer George's questions about homelessness, but it had evolved into something much more significant, an education in true leadership and an example of how royal influence could be used constructively. The anniversary of their first visit to Pathways Trust was marked not with celebration, but with reflection on how much had been accomplished and how much work remained to be done. Homelessness hadn't been eliminated, but public awareness had been transformed, policy approaches had been improved, and hundreds of individuals had received more effective support. George returned to the center that day, not as a curious child, but as a committed advocate. He spent time with new visitors, listening to their stories, and sharing what he had learned about available resources. He met with staff members to discuss ongoing challenges and potential solutions. Most importantly, he continued to ask questions. His curiosity hadn't been satisfied by learning about homelessness. It had been expanded to encompass broader issues of social inequality and systemic injustice. "What's next?" Sarah Chin asked as George's second visit was winding down. "Housing policy," George replied without hesitation. "I want to understand why we don't build enough affordable homes and what it would take to change that." As they left Pathways Trust that day, William realized that his son's initial question about street homelessness had launched a journey of discovery and engagement that would likely continue for the rest of George's life. The future king was developing not just knowledge about social issues, but a deep personal commitment to addressing them. The story that had begun with a simple question from a curious child had evolved into something much larger, a demonstration of how genuine engagement and sustained commitment could create meaningful change, and an example of how the next generation of leaders might approach their responsibilities to serve others. In the car on the way home, George was already making plans for his next area of study. "Papa, do you think we could visit some families who are struggling to pay their rent? I want to understand what happens before people become homeless." William smiled, recognizing that his son had learned the most important lesson of all, that understanding complex problems requires continuous learning, that helping people requires sustained commitment, and that real leadership means never stopping asking how things could be better. The ripples from that first morning at Pathways Trust would continue spreading for years to come, touching lives and changing systems in ways that couldn't be fully measured but could be clearly felt in the increased dignity and support available to some of society's most vulnerable members. George's journey from curious child to informed advocate was just beginning, but it had already demonstrated something important about the potential for positive change when privilege meets genuine compassion and sustained commitment to learning and action.